Good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and family of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. We are bringing you situation operational update directly from Jerusalem. I'm honored to be sitting in the main conference room, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, in our daily alert wartime diplomacy center, together with two esteemed colleagues of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Dr. Mansdorf, a political affairs psychologist and an expert in counterterrorism and terror trauma, and our own Lieutenant Colonel Reserve Advocate Maurice Hirsch, former military advocate in Judea and Samaria of the Israel Defense Forces and a Middle East expert. This is our daily brief update and assessment of the ongoing and evolving conflict, or I should say response to a mass murder, a massacre of Israeli children, women, men, and soldiers that took place on Shabbat and continued into yesterday, Sunday, and today, where there have been scores of terrorists that apparently had made their way through tunnels into Israel, and Israeli forces are still fighting to secure Israeli sovereignty in Israeli towns and cities. Operationally, we don't know how many hostages, well over 100 hostages, probably well over 150 hostages held in Gaza by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, it should be said. More than 700 Israelis killed. That number, according to Minister Dermer, in the last hours is understood to be a minimum number and should probably, unfortunately, grow substantially, as well as more than 2,500 Israelis who have been wounded and being treated in hospitals across the country. 4,400 rockets have been fired to date from Hamas in Gaza, and that number continues as we speak to you from Jerusalem. The purpose of these operational and situational updates and analyses is to create context and perspective and to counter the massive fake news propaganda and disinformation that is flooding the social networks from Hamas and from its Iranian paymasters in Tehran. This, we want to emphasize, from Jerusalem, is very much an Iranian regime operation that has been carried out by its Hamas proxies. And as we've been arguing and assessing at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs with our many experts on Iran, the Iranian regime is operating and mobilizing the Middle East like a chessboard, which it's been doing for years. And it has just moved its Hamas night, if you will, that undertook an unprecedented massacre of Israeli civilians in the southern part of Israel. And it really, I think, shows the level of barbarity of these Hamas terror operatives that some of you have seen the social network results, the photographs, the grisly photographs and pictures, which are making their way around the online community, but entire families have been wiped out, butchered, shot, hanged, and worse. And we're here to try to put this whole thing into context and to try to share with you what is evolving now and what is quite likely to happen in the coming hours and days as Israel recovers its resilience, its moral clarity, its strategic clarity, and prepares for a massive retaliation and hopefully decapitation of the entire Hamas leadership. I'm joined by two colleagues, as I said before. Dr. Mansdorf is a senior fellow at Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and one of the leading experts in Israel on trauma. Erwin, can you share with our friends, family, and colleagues abroad some of the key issues in the next couple of minutes about terror trauma? It seems that Israel as an entire society has been shocked to its very core by what's happened here, because unlike 1973, which was 50 years ago, this was not a military operation or even a counter-terror operation on the traditional military battlefield. This was men, women, and children actually holding the southern line and sacrificing their lives in the face of barbaric terrorists with knives in their teeth and automatic weapons, shooting them at point-blank range. So it's a mass execution of Jewish civilians. What kind of trauma does that create? How does the society handle this and handle somewhere between 100 and 200 kidnapped children, elderly people and soldiers and civilians in Gaza.
So as you say, this is something that we really haven't faced before. And as far as the Israeli public feels, I would ask the viewers, how do you feel? And I think that everyone feels shocked, surprised, disappointed, angry. All those feelings that you probably feel are the feelings that we feel, and we feel it even more. And there's, the question of how we're going to handle that is really something that needs to be clarified over the next few months and years, because this is a societal trauma, not an individual trauma. When it comes to individual trauma, we know how to deal with PTSD. There's certain treatment approaches, there's medications, there's groups. A societal trauma, the last time we experienced something like this was Yom Kippur in 1973. The society experienced something like this in 1948. And each culture and each generation has its way of getting out of it. But what I want to point out is something else. And when it comes to Hamas, it's this type of trauma that we have that is now, I would say, demanding a very clear and massive response. In past operations that we've had with Gaza, there's always been a debate within the Israeli public. Do we take over Gaza? Do we get rid of Hamas? Do we just try to deter them for the moment? And the argument has always been that if we just deter them for the moment, it's just going to happen again and again and again. And that's the history of what's happened. It's had happened again and again and again. And one of the tools that, and Hamas used that throughout the years to really strengthen themselves and get to the position where they're able to do this type of attack. Now, one of the concepts that I've spoken about is a concept known as psychological asymmetry. Now, what's psychological asymmetry? In military operations, in asymmetric wars, when we have a very strong force against a very weak force. So traditionally, Israel was considered the strong force, Hamas is the weak force, and this would be what you would call an asymmetric war. In an asymmetric war, especially when you have a terror organization, it allows them to do whatever they want. They're not bound by the rules of war. They're not bound by Geneva. They're not bound by world opinion. And what they've done,
or basic morality, even,
or as we see. So what we've seen in terms of the asymmetry is that they use that asymmetry to actually become the stronger force, because what happens is that they use the pictures and photos and images of what happens to their population during a retaliation, and they cynically use this in order to engage and to buttress world opinion against Israel. And that's happened a number of times. We can go back historically. It's happened with Hezbollah and Kafr Kana twice, where because of accidental civilian injuries, the Israeli operation had to stop. Now, the goals are almost agreed upon as far as this operation is concerned, to deal Hamas a massive blow to where either they're decapitated, they're finished, they're taken over, but their ability to launch this type of, or any type of military operation would be gone for years or hopefully forever. In order to do that, there has to be a response that's been different than the response in the past. And the response in the past has always gone up to a certain point and then stopped. And most of the time it stopped because the credit that Israel had internationally as far as carrying out an operation ends when the humanitarian picture in Gaza comes out, and there's all kinds of reactions and pressures on Israel to end work then. This can't happen now. If this happens now, then Hamas continues and is basically rewarded for as you often say, Dan, an ISIS type operation. And that can't happen.
What's happened here, I want to bring in Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, in both of you, is that there has been a massacre, not only of hundreds, maybe thousands of Israeli citizens, but there's been a massacre of a conception. Nearly 50 years ago to the week was the destruction of a false Israeli conception about Egypt and Syria and their intention and their capability of launching a surprise attack, what's called in the literature a strategic surprise. And almost 50 years to the day, or certainly the week, we have another strategic surprise. But this strategic surprise goes way beyond anything that Israel or the Jewish people have experienced any time since the refounding of the Jewish state, which was that since Oslo and at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, we've just written Oslo at 30. And in fact, I would argue the critical view that we've taken at Oslo at 30, which you can see at jcpa.org, really is kind of a premonition in a sense, conceptually, to what happened on Shabbat and what continues to happen actually as we sit here and update you, because the idea was, and Lieutenant Colonel Hirsch, you were as the former head of research at Palestinian Media Watch and now a fellow and now a senior legal department at PMW under Itamar Marcus and the great work that they do at PMW, and now at the Jerusalem Center in the running the Palestinian Accountability and Reform Initiative together with us and our senior board member Sandra Gerber. The conception was that Israel could actually pay and encourage economic peace with a fledgling Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, so-called, and Gaza. Gaza obviously was taken over in a violent overthrow by the Hamas in 2007. But the idea since 2007, for the last 16 years, has been that Israel could maintain a status quo by allowing money to flow through Qatari banks and Qatari cash, as well as Israeli, by the way, payments to the Hamas leadership, keeping the Hamas leadership weak enough that it could manage the affairs of its de facto state, and it wouldn't dare take such a savage unilateral action as to send thousands of terrorists across the border and massacre Israelis. That conception has been massacred by itself, and Israel is now back in its original security conception, which is based on the triangle of national security. What do you think, Maurice?
So I think that what I'd like to do is I'd make 2 points into that. Firstly, as regards the level of the surprise and of the catastrophe, I think that we have to take into account, and also for the ensuing trauma, that what Hamas managed to do, what the terrorists from Gaza managed to do on Shabbat, was even a greater success than the Yom Kippur War in their eyes. Just, I'll give you a small example for you guys and for the listeners, for the viewers to understand. Along the fence with Gaza is a line of kibbutzim, some famous kibbutz Be'eri, Nachal Oz. These are kibbutzim that have been around for a very long time. When the Egyptians surprised us in 1973, they attacked the Bar-Lev line. It was at the end of Sinai towards the Suez Canal. What Hamas and Fatah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad managed to do on Shabbat is to wipe out entire communities. There is no one to return back to Nachal Oz. There is no one to return back to Be'eri. These places, their residents were either slaughtered or kidnapped. That's going to be the national trauma, that these places were entirely, I think, wiped out. The common factor, I think, between discussing Oslo, the Oslo Accords, and the events of Shabbat is clearly to understand that there is no ideological difference between Fatah and Hamas. You're right, Dan. Hamas did violently seize control of the Gaza Strip from Fatah in 2007, but their disagreement is only about who's going to lead the war to destroy the Jewish country. It's not about whether this side wants peace, the other side doesn't want peace. It's who's leading the war. This is the internal.
The other part, is very well said, Maurice. I just want to point out, and both of you have written about this, by the way, as I have, and that is that part of the collapse conception here is that the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority, the PA, is the more moderate, it is the diplomatically legitimate and accepted international pre-state organization that even has, the PLO is now a non-member observer state in the United Nations, which was done illegally in 2011, the unilateral Declaration of Independence in violation of the Oslo Accords. But more to the point, they, as Maurice Hirsch says, if you look at the Palestinian media discourse, public discourse, school book discourse, mosque discourse, the preachers in the mosque, you will see the same rhetoric being used to slaughter the Jews, to defile that, according to them, defile the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, let's bear in mind the name of this Hamas slaughterhouse operation in English is called the Flood of Al-Aqsa. This is how they called it. So they're trying once again to mobilize the Arab Muslim world against Israel to ignite the match on the gasoline that they've poured all over Israel now with this opening salvo massacre, and to try to get the entire Middle East in order to attack Israel from all sides, as Yasser Arafat did. Let's remember, back in 2000, he did the same thing around the Temple Mount. It was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Another comment before we go to questions, guys?
Just one thing I want to back up what Maurice said. One of the evidence that Fatah and Hamas are really two sides of the same coin is take a look at the statement that Abu Mazen has made regarding this particular operation. He supports it. Unlike some other Arab countries, most notably the UAE, there's no statement of any sort of responsibility of or acceptance of the horror of what happened. Fatah accepts what happens and supports Hamas for this. So it's another thing to keep in mind is if we're talking about a two-state solution, this very well could have happened in Judea and Samaria in another type of scenario that would have been similar to Gaza. If we would have had, or we will have, a two-state solution with Judea and Samaria, the types of things that we saw in Gaza could happen there as well, and that would then endanger the entire country.
Well, I
would just remove the word could. I think if we don't understand that if Hamas or the PA is allowed to control the entire highlands of Judea and Samaria and to completely dominate Israel's coastal plain, I think it will be and have the opportunity to freely train their terrorists and arm their terrorists to murder Jews. It will only be a short amount of time before we see exactly the same actions, the exact same barbarism coming from Judea and Samaria into the rest of Israel. And I don't think it's a question of it could happen. It's something that will happen if we ever give up on that option.
I just want to remind ourselves in this room here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, our esteemed library, as well as our dear friends, families, and colleagues across the sea, that the Iranian regime agents have been ensconced and embedded in the terror tunnels in Gaza since 2018. I mean, we know that for a fact from our sources in Gaza and from other empirical evidence that the Iranian regime has had agents in Gaza. Pictures of Khamenei have been seen throughout Gaza since 2018. And though that same Iranian regime from Tehran has agents and operatives working in Jenin and in Nablus. So what everyone here in our collective participatory update in the Situation Room here at JCPA remembers that just a couple of months ago, we know that the Iranian regime and President Raisi and as well as the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the IRGC and their Quds Force, their foreign terror arm, had dispatched Iranian operatives and proxies. As we know, the PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, is a branch office of the IRGC in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria. And we know that the Hamas operatives are working as well in Nablus and Jenin and Tulkarm and in other cities under Palestinian Authority control, according to the Oslo agreements of 1995, the interim agreement of 1995. So to see that the Iranian regime octopus has been surrounding Israel with its long tentacles is clear in Judea and Samaria and Hill Ridge. And this is the important point that Maurice just made. You can, if you go onto our site at jcpa.org and just put in defensible borders for Israel, you can see a number of different very sharply written English language policy books on Israel's needs for defensible borders. What Maurice was saying just a minute ago is if, God forbid, there was a Hamastan type of entity or even a Fatah entity in the high ground, what's called the Judean Samarian Hill Ridge, which sits up several thousand feet above sea level, overlooking the Ben Gurion Airport, overlooking the majority of Israel's infrastructure, highways, utilities, and overlooking all of our communities in the Sharon area, in the Tel Aviv area towards the Mediterranean Sea, we would have Gaza in the hills overlooking the low ground,
There's already
3,200
been
feet
attempts
below.
at some
Absolutely.
makeshift weapons being sent
Yeah.
in
So-
the north.
This is going to become an important discussion point as we move forward in Israel, as you say, is going to have to exercise massive force in order to radically fundamentally change the situation in Gaza by eliminating the
But that's the thing to be aware of. We should be
Hamas
aware
leadership.
that this is going to happen. And we should be aware that they will use the results of that massive force in order to stop the operation. And that's something that they've done in the past, and we learned from history, and we should be prepared that this is something they will try again. Right now, there's credit. Right now, there's world opinion behind Israel. How long that will last, in light of the images that are likely to come out, that's really the question. That's something that everybody should be aware of.
And that should really be as in our position, really as advisors, as advisors on policy, how to go forward. Israel's military operation that has started already this afternoon, with a massive bombing of the northern areas of Gaza, and specific warnings being given to the Al Rimal neighborhood, which is really the expensive neighborhood of Gaza City, where all the heads of Hamas live. The message should be, as Prime Minister Netanyahu already said to the Palestinian civilians, we don't have any argument with you, we don't have a fight with you, leave your homes, go south, go towards Egypt. The border, Gaza has a border with Egypt, and the Palestinians can leave, the innocent Palestinians can leave that way. We have the specific intention of attacking the terrorists and of attacking and destroying their infrastructure. And that is something which the civilian population in Gaza should understand and take the warnings seriously.
Absolutely. They were talking mostly about Gaza City. In other words, they've established, it's very important to clarify, and I think many of our colleagues and friends abroad know this, that the Hamas has been committing double war crimes by ensconcing and embedding themselves under mosques, in hospitals, in schools, and even so those run by the United Nations, and at the same time embedding themselves using children and women as human shields as they indiscriminately fire rockets into Israeli schools and synagogues and communities. So this is something that we have to remind ourselves. I think that what Dr. Mansdorf is saying here is very important, that visually the pyrotechnics of this will always look like it'll either be victim and victor, it'll be strong and weak. And that is those are the visuals that have determined the legitimacy for Israel to counterattack 4 times since 2008-9. Here we have a completely different situation in which it is not going to be merely a counterstrike but what they call a full-blown fundamental change in the reality in Gaza. Perhaps we'll go to some questions where Daniel Levin is our director of operations, who's running very kindly running this update. Daniel, there are questions or comments from our friends abroad that you can share with us? No question, no open questions. Okay, that's great. So, guys, you have
so maybe while our audience is thinking of questions, you mentioned that
they can send questions, by the way, by the chat. We can see them on the screen. So please feel very free to ask or make comments or ask questions that we can respond to here. And we will respond in the coming few minutes. We have another 10 minutes or so for this briefing, and we'd be delighted to engage in conversation and in commentary or questions that you have.
So I think you mentioned before, Dan, that Hamas even uses the UN apparatus knowingly or unknowingly. Look at the demographics of Gaza, right? Demographics of Gaza, you have according to UNRWA numbers, a massive part of the population that are refugees, registered UN refugees, receiving all the benefits of being the refugees, somewhere in the region of 40 to 50% of the population. That means of the 3,000 terrorists, statistically, that swarmed Israel yesterday and massacred Jews on Shabbat, 50% probably were educated in UNRWA schools. This is part of that education system this is part of the fundamental change that Israel needs to also implement. It's not only getting rid of Hamas, it's getting rid of that whole institutionalized idea of teaching the next generation of Palestinians that they have the hope, that's the Palestinian refugees, that one day you will return and flood and destroy Israel, even if it's demographically. That's the idea, and this is the product. The product is abject hatred. The product is the ability to go and murder entire families, and to kidnap 84-year-old women. I heard a story on the way here of an Israeli actor whose brother and grandmother lives in Nahal Oz. They were on the phone all morning as she cried to him that the terrorists were getting closer and closer to her safe room, and eventually the connection was lost. He next saw her driving on a vehicle being dragged into Gaza, an 84-year-old woman.
Yeah, this is
one of the hostages. Just so that people understand the level to which these people are sunk.
Julian, thank you very much for your question. Brigitte, thank you for your question as well, by an anonymous participant. Let's, Julian, your question is the $64,000 question. How do you explain the security failure to anticipate and then react quickly to this massive infiltration of what we know now to be well over 1,000 terrorists? We thought it was, in the beginning, we thought it was a few hundred, but it even could be into a couple of thousand terrorists. I mean, the mass murder that was committed within an hour of the 6:30 a.m. Shabbat morning Simchat Torah massacre was of such magnitude and pointed to a colossal, we have to admit, a colossal failure of Israeli early warning systems, of even human warning systems. And that is still being assessed and analyzed. There's not much information. There's a lot of speculation about what happened. There's been some suggestion that the Iranian regime executed a major cyber attack exactly at that time, shutting down Israeli electronic surveillance and warning systems. I mean, let's be very clear. There's been an Ugda. There's been a whole division right down in the Gaza areas with top fighters from the Golani divisions, paratrooper divisions, special forces. This was not just a operational screw up or mistake. It is far larger than that. We don't know what caused this complete collapse of Israel's warning systems around the fence. There is a question that has to be asked on Julian's question is, how is it that the fence was only a fence, that it wasn't 10 or 12 or 15 meters deep, and people approaching that fence would either be shocked by the electronic waves or be shot?
So I think I was just speaking before our briefing to an ex-senior head in also in Israel's security agency in the Shabak, exactly on this point. What happened? It wasn't only the failure on the fence itself, but rather the failure to gather information. There were 3,000 people who stormed the borders. They stormed to exact points, 29 different sites along the border. They didn't all go to one site. This was a coordinated, very well organized, very intelligence-heavy attack that was carried out with precision under complete secrecy. That was the initial failure. The fact that the fence then failed, well, that's the old adage of every time we prepare, we're preparing for the war that was and not the war to come. So the wall that's been built with Gaza goes underground and stops all of the tunnels that Hamas was going to use in the 2014 war to infiltrate Israel in the same way as Hezbollah was going to do that. And so we built down, but we didn't make sure that we were fortifying upwards. So this time they just came over the top.
Absolutely.
They took a simple JCB digger, moved the fence out of the way, and thousands of terrorists stormed.
You know, it's rather extraordinary, Julian, and our friends abroad, is that it took 20 or 20 some odd minutes for scores of white Hamas pickup trucks loaded with 10 or 12 terrorists with thousands of rounds of ammunition to reach these 22 or 25 kibbutzim and towns around, the Gaza, what they call the Gaza border area. And there was just no human attention, no early warning. And you're talking about a convoy of thousands just in those trucks, 1,000 people that overwhelmed both people in the army who were sleeping. By the way, it was Simchat Torah, Shmini Atzeret, and Shabbat. And this is the day of rest of the army, and no prior warning. And here's the result.
What you both addressed right now is another aspect of why this trauma among the Israeli public is the way it is. It's all this leads you to the conclusion of having a lack of confidence in people that you thought will always be there when you need them. And that's another reason why the military response really needs to be something massive and restorative.
Right.
And to restore the confidence.
Let's take Bridget's question.
Deterrence, but our belief in the army.
Yeah, deterrence and confidence in our own security forces, which is part of the perceptual war. Brigitte Gabriel, thank you very much for a very important question, which is the parallel between the flood of Al-Aqsa, the name of this particular terror, a savage, barbaric terror massacre. And we, as Brigitte reminds us, as Arafat branded the 2000 Al-Aqsa terror war, it was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. So then it's very clear that the Palestinian Authority leadership, as well as the Hamas leadership, have been constantly, and Mahmoud Abbas has been doing this constantly, is invoking Al-Aqsa and the filthy feet of the Jews in Al-Aqsa and the pure blood of the shahidim, the sacrificers in Al-Aqsa, in order to try to coalesce the entire Muslim world and the 350 Arab Muslims in the Middle East as well, notwithstanding all the Muslims in Indonesia and around the world, in order to really perpetuate a jihad against Israel. Now, clearly, as Brigitte asked in the question, there is an intention to try to drive a wedge between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, pay attention, something very interesting here. Here, the Iranian regime and the Saudi government have come together in a temporary, several month old, let's call it alliance or a diplomatic understanding. And here, the partner of Saudi Arabia, the Iranian regime, has now attacked and massively killed Israel as part of that new peace covenant between Saudi Arabia and
yes, but will this continue to work? I mean, that's the question that we need to answer. This has been the way it's been in the past, but the past is not today. Today we have the Abraham Accords. Today we have an Arab public that sees things a little differently. We have a Saudi public that sees things differently. And it's really an open question if the tactic of using Al-Aqsa to inflame everybody is really going to work now. And I think we'll see. We'll see if it does. But one of the things that we're doing here at the JCPA is having a whole Arab language section that is really presenting this information to the Arab public, to the Arab-speaking public. And this is something that is one of the things that we're allowed to do now, and we're able to do now that we weren't able to do in the past. And it's something that time will tell if this ploy of using Al-Aqsa is really going to work or not.
Absolutely. And let's just move on to, there's an anonymous participant who asked a very important question. It's time to study the Allies program after World War II to talk about the denazification of society. Here you have clearly a Nazification of Gaza. It's a Nazified society. By the way, the Palestinian Authority also using Nazi and Soviet conspiracy themes. If I might, in a moment of a lack of modesty, if you would look online at Oslo at 30, I have just penned an article exactly about this idea. This is a compendium that was very skillfully edited by Maurice Hirsch, who is the director of the Palestinian Authority Accountability Initiative. It's online at jcpa.org. Just look for Oslo at 30. And there's an article that I wrote recently, published in the compendium, called the Palestinian Authority and Nazi and Soviet conspiracy theories. This is exactly the type of behavior and ideology that has long infected and represented the Palestinian Authority as well as the Hamas. Remember, the Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the International Muslim Brotherhood, which can be traced all the way back to 1928. Hassan al-Banna, he himself was a student of the Nazi regime and very much continued the Nazi legacy through the Muslim Brotherhood, and then he passed that on to Said Qutb, who became a forebearer of Al-Qaeda across the region. So this is a very serious issue of the denazification. This is very much what Maurice talked about in terms of the school books, because you see some of the Nazi and Soviet Jew hatred themes are across the Palestinian discourse, and this is going part of the conception that has been massacred here in these last 2 horrible days of unimaginable catastrophe. Let's just continue to Deanne. Deanne Meyer asked, where is the UN finally calling the Hamas terrorists? Deanne, here's part of the problem: is that the Hamas as a non-state actor cannot be determined at anything. And
this is what we discussed. This is what we discussed yesterday as well, Dan. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, there was actually an initiative in the UN to define Hamas as a terrorist organization. It was unfortunately defeated. Amazingly, how could it not be clear that Hamas is a terrorist organization? But the UN famously or infamously even refuses to accept the plain reality that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They use all types of language to discuss the de facto leaders of the Gaza Strip. Everything short of saying these are homicidal terrorists. And that's something which, as we recommended yesterday, for anyone who watched the brief that we had yesterday, was that we are calling also on everyone who can contact your MPs, contact your congressman, contact every person possible to promote the idea of having Hamas designated as a terrorist organization within the near future by the UN, and not just by America and England and Israel and most of and Europe and most of the civilized world. This is an action plan that needs to happen now, because at the moment for the UN, Hamas is just another humanitarian organization, and the de facto leadership in Gaza, and they are dealt with reverence and respect, and in completely ignoring the Hamas charter, which still calls for Israel's destruction.
Absolutely. Raphael Wilson, addressing your far-reaching solution for the problem in Gaza would be, as you say, to nuke Gaza off the face of the earth. Well, it's an important moment for us to say, and Attorney Hirsch can emphasize to all of us that Israel comports with international law and the laws of war, even though the Hamas doesn't. The Hamas doesn't, because it's a non-state organization, and it wouldn't if it were a state organization. And this is exactly the problem we face opposite Hamas and the PA as non-state actors. But you're not that far off, because while Israel won't nuke Gaza off the face of the earth, they will. I think it's fair to say we will all see a level of force. And I would call it, in former General Norman Schwarzkopf's lexicon, shock and awe that the United States inflicted on the Saddam Hussein's regime back in 1991, and then again in 2003, that the entire Middle East will be watching very carefully at the massive Israeli response, and they will think very carefully about whether to take action. That this is exactly the type of restoration of deterrence that both Dr. Mansdorf and Maurice have been talking about. And this operation is going to start in the coming hours and days. And so this is where we really need your support, supporting Israel, standing with Israel, calling for freedom of the hostages unconditionally, but standing with Israel and joining us every day as we have additional context, analysis, assessment, and operational and situational observations, reportage to you from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Please tell your friends to join us. Send us jcpa@jcpa.org. We'll send everyone invitations. We want to have hundreds and hundreds of people on these in these situational analyses and assessments. I think we bring a certain perspective that no other institute or center brings in Israel. Just to go down to Louis Goldberg, it is a shock. What happened on Shabbat is a shock to the entire community. The public, yes, I think right now the public is united, is shocked to its core and resilient.
A month ago, no. Today, yes.
A month ago, no, and today, yes. That's the short answer, Louis. It's a good question because that had been the having no appetite for a ground war is now considered a war of no choice. A war of no choice, a war of survival.
And whilst a month ago we might have been considering some type of reluctance for the IDF soldiers to turn up, the official numbers of the IDF for today is over 150% turn up, which
means people turning
which
up
is
without
even causing
being called.
problems. People turning up without being called. There is a massive response of the Israeli society to these events, and there's no question that public resolve.
And I think to add to the type of national unity here, you will see a national emergency government emerge in the coming hours, or certainly the coming day or two. There are already serious discussions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and General Benny Gantz, the head of the opposition, as well as Yair Lapid, who is also
The formal head of the opposition. Yair is the formal head of the opposition.
No, Yair's for Benny Gantz today and Sar are the co-heads of the opposition with the largest opposition party. And Lapid, the former prime minister, we should say, for a limited period of time. But this is the first time in months and months and months that these three actors, these three gentlemen, are sitting together seriously and forming a national emergency, what they call a professional emergency government and cabinet. So that will add to the sense of unity. I think it's fair to say that the divisive yet very dramatic judicial reform issue is being put on the side, and there you will see all these protests have disappeared suddenly due to the shock and awe that Israel suffered over the last 48 now to 72 hours. And so you see a resilient and united Israeli body politic that we haven't seen here in a very, very long time. In a line with these very unfortunate and tragic circumstances. Rafi.
That's why we want Benny Gantz and Eisenkot into the government. That's why we're talking about a war cabinet that have people that have experience, that have been in situations like this, that know the alternatives, and that won't operate strictly on the basis of emotion, but will operate on the basis of strategy and on the basis of logic. And experience, and that's the clear.
Given the proviso, I would suggest that they are able to relieve themselves of the conceptions that they've held for the last 20 years of ignoring the threat coming from Gaza, subduing it. Let's just mow the lawn.
Which has been more than a military. It's been a
Benny Gantz was the head of the army in 2014. They need to, when Netanyahu brings and widens his government, he needs to ensure that those come in with the new idea of what has happened and the ability to change the way that they see the conflict.
And has been said on Israeli media over and over again. This is a moment that everybody's changing their disc.
Yeah,
they're flipping over.
Changing. Yeah, Rafi, the reaction, the Hamas probably knew, may have known that Israel's reaction may be to shut off electricity, water, and petrol, but not necessarily so, because Israel hadn't done it before. This is exactly the conception that has collapsed. With that, Israel, since its unilateral retreat and destruction of 8,000 or 9,000, the communities of 8,000 or 9,000 Jews that had lived there for 2 generations, Israel did not, since 2005, shut off the electricity and water, which had been a matter of great controversy in the Israeli discourse. Why, if we left Gaza, why are we supplying water? Why are we supplying petrol? Why are we supplying electricity? Either you go out or you don't go out. You are not half pregnant. And this has been this decision today made by the Minister of Infrastructure to shut off the water and electricity is a very long time in coming, all the way since 2005, almost 20 years.
I think it's one of the things that Hamas actually assumed, as they have done, as has happened previously, that they will be able to use Israel's electricity and be able to force Israel via international pressure to continue providing electricity and fuel, using pictures of the apparently starving Palestinian Gazans or the people in Gaza as weapons against Israel to force us to really act against our own best interest. And I don't think they necessarily took into account that Israel would have the ability and be capable of making the decision that we finally need to cut our enemies off from the electricity that we supply them with, from the fuel that we supply them with. And why would they believe anything else? That's not been the case for the last 20 years. And so I don't believe that they think that is really something which was going to happen or is even sustainable. And that is something where Israel's government really has to show also to the international community. This is an intentional move to try and persuade you to force Israel to work against its own best interest. And that's something which Israel has to work against.
It's likely to be the first example of the asymmetric relationship that I spoke about.
Exactly.
And there's already been talk. I heard Abu Mazen reacting to this, saying that he will go to the Hague if this actually happens. So
that's all right. By the way, Mahmoud Abbas, as many of you, or at least some of you may know, every Hamas terrorist who is captured or killed receives an annuity for life from the Palestinian Authority budget that is financed by the United States government, financed by the state of Israel, and financed by the European Union. It's just it should be clear that they pay over $350 million a year in these types of incentivization programs from the official Palestinian Authority budget. They are actors that are complicit in the massacre that occurred on Shabbat in several ways, both financially and actively, as we've come to learn. Let me thank all of you for joining us today. We've expended our allotted time, but do join us again tomorrow at the same time when we will be sending out a reminder and having a whole new set of assessments, context, perspective, questions, answers, and your commentary. Very important to us. Please go to jcpa.org, see the wartime daily alert section on our homepage. And please, if you're inclined to support the JCPA, we have launched the first ever Arabic and Farsi communication center at JCPA. We're in touch with 30 Arab African countries and the broadest swath of the Iranian opposition, and we have stories going out in those languages, which is a major element in the war against disinformation against the state of Israel. So please take a look at our site, and we're pleased to have you in our JCPA family. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bring your friends, bring your family, bring everyone, and we'll be here.